With more than 150 singles under his belt, 14 of which were number ones in the UK, and hits in every decade across a career spanning an incredible 52 years, it's hard to know where to begin playing the music of Sir Cliff Richard. You know, the current generation often thinks of Cliff as old hat, and they may not realise this was a British rock and roll star adored by millions of screaming women. Like his hero, Elvis Presley, he was mean and moody on stage and similarly found his way into films and television. Being American, Elvis didn't have the career option of the Eurovision Song Contest. Well, in recent years it's been fashionable to knock Cliff, but his track record speaks for itself in the UK, where he's sold more records than Presley or the Beatles. And of course, he's still going strong. To mark his 70th birthday, Sir Cliff Richard chose to perform a week of concerts at the Royal Albert Hall in London. And while other radio stations had to wait for him to finish the series of 6 shows, Reading 107 was given the chance to talk exclusively to Sir Cliff in a break from rehearsals in Portugal. I'll be asking about those photographs for his new calendar, where Sir Cliff's head appears to have been superimposed on the body of a 35-year-old bloke. No, you're right, it really is his. We'll also hear his views on talent shows like X Factor and the stars they've produced, and why conducting this interview brought back fond memories for me personally. I'm Dan Chisholm. Welcome to Sir Cliff at 70 on Reading 107. While most people think of his solo hits, Cliff Richard's made some great recordings with other artists along the way, like that one from 1982, She Means Nothing to Me, which was recorded with another artist from the rock and roll era, Phil Everly. You know, although a few years younger, I have grown up with Cliff Richard's music. As music trends have changed through the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s, Cliff was always around. Later we'll talk about how his success and longevity is probably due to being the master of reinvention. But really, it's incredible that Sir Cliff is 70 today, and he's taking time out from his concert dates at the Royal Albert Hall in London for a small celebration this evening. But looking back into the history books, I noticed he seems to quite like working on his birthday week.
Well, the thing is, it's a strange fact of life that in Britain and Europe, we tend to tour late autumn and winter. And I'm happy that this is happening in October because I've got less chance of catching somebody else's flu. It's the vulnerable, the human side of us that there's nothing we can do about. So we tend to always work at that time. So therefore, I have very often been working on my birthday because it happens to be like the start of all the tours that ever happen. I'm trying to change things. I'm hoping they'll let me tour in the summer in Europe, and that would be fantastic because people still want to go out. I mean, I did a tour a few years ago called Castles in the Air, and I played all the stately homes and things, and we had a good time. Okay, we just missed the rain all the time, and poor Tom Jones and Donny Osmond got rained upon because they came past after me, but I was lucky enough. But it meant that we can all of us keep fit. But that's the reason why I tend to work on my birthdays. It tends to be the start of the touring season.
I really can't get my brain around the concept that you're 70 this year, and congratulations on that.
Thank you.
I suppose really the question is that a lot of people will certainly be on the mind of many men as well as many women. Having seen the pictures in the press of your new calendar, how come you still appear to have the body of a 35-year-old?
Oh, it's getting younger and younger. I did read somewhere that they thought I had a body of a 45-year-old, and I was quite thrilled with that. But I think it's just, sometimes it's a bit of good fortune if you have the right genes. I've never really believed all the stories. The Peter Pan of pop and all that stuff, and, Cliff never ages. Well, I see myself in the mirror, and I think I've aged. But perhaps physically, now I'm 70, I look in the mirror and think, well, I don't really look like some 70-year-olds I've met anyway, so I may just be lucky. Although I've worked hard, as you know, over the years, various kind of eating regimes and lifestyles, trying to keep it as smooth and as healthily as possible, and maybe now it's paying off. I've lived with this body for 70 years. How come people are only just noticing it?
I mean, you hinted to this a short time ago, but to achieve longevity in a music career these days, it really does seem that an artist not only has to have the talent, but they also have to be very committed in terms of the lifestyle, and clearly that's borne fruit of labours for you.
Oh, yes, it has, and I think, there's no doubt when you listen to X Factor and the pop, American Pop Idol and stuff like that, there are some fantastic singers walking our streets that we didn't even know existed. it's really up to them, because it's what I've heard, there isn't anybody that's won those things that hasn't the ability to have longevity. A voice is a voice, and if you've got a good voice, you should be able to make good records forever and please that group of people that become your hardened fans. I have a feeling that there are two things I feel. I've spouted about this a couple of times. I think there's a change in our industry where perhaps the new artists are not supported through the bad days. I mean, my first 4 records were not number ones, and in fact Move It reached number 2, and then the other 3 were heading down the charts. 7, 9, 17, and then Living Doll. In the meantime, Norrie Paramore and Peter Gormley, my manager, was saying, don't panic, we'll find the right song. They didn't dump us, because it was going downhill, they didn't dump us. They believed in us. So that's one factor that I think has changed. I don't think these young folks get the same support we had. And the other thing, it might be in the artists' minds. Maybe we're coming out of that period of life where everybody's fast food, everybody wants their 15 minutes of fame, and maybe a lot of them are happy to have 15 minutes of fame. I come from a generation of people who were not happy with that. We thought as soon as we saw the possibility, we grabbed it. And of course, if you have longevity, then you have to have worked for it. You can't just sit back and then go in the studio, make a record, forget about the interviews, forget about doing concerts, forget about the public. You have to keep at it, and that's the word you mentioned, commitment, and I think that's a major part of it.
There's one of Cliff's hits from the 1960s, which really stands the test of time. In the country, it reached number 6 at the end of 1966.
Sir Clifford 70 on Reading 107.
Now, a few moments ago, we heard Sir Cliff saying that many of today's stars from talent shows like The X Factor have got what it takes to have a long career in music, but whether they've the support to achieve that is a different matter. Well, in September 1958, when Cliff and his band got together for their first rehearsal in his living room, life was very different. Their aspirations and aims were quite modest too.
Well, the aspirations were pretty basic, Rock and roll had started, and as far as we were concerned, as far as I'm concerned now, the prototype of all rock stars of any caliber at all came from Elvis. He was the first one that showed attitude. Not only, well, he didn't show attitude so much in his conversational, like his interviews, because he was unbelievably Southern polite. I mean, yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am. And there was never any kind of rebellionism, so to speak, there. Okay, his life may have had a bit of rebelliousness in it, but he was incredibly polite. But everything in his physique and the way he performed was saying, this is how I am doing it. I don't care what's come before me. And he was the great inspiration for people like me. There were thousands of us that wanted to wake up and be Elvis. I mean, I learned pretty quickly that you couldn't do that, but his was the inspiration. So my aspirations were to try and be somewhere in his world. And I was one of the lucky ones. I kind of broke through, found myself. I think Living Doll helped me find that there were all sorts of elements in the phrase rock and roll. It wasn't just a tempo, it was a whole musical format.
It was interesting when a recent album surfaced of recordings from you live at the ABC in Kingston in 1962, yes, where you probably couldn't have heard the band because women were screaming so loudly.
I know. Those days were crazy because don't forget, when we played in those days, that night, for instance, was only recordable because EMI came down and mic'd us all properly. Otherwise, normally, we didn't carry sound systems, we didn't carry lighting systems. We played in cinemas. They switched, the lights came on and off, basically. And the sound was the microphone that was part of the hall. And if they had 2 more, Bruce and Hank would sing into them. Otherwise, they'd come to me and sing in my mic over my shoulder. And so it was pretty basic stuff, And that session, though, when I heard it again, I phoned Hank immediately and said, they've got this tape and they want to release it. And he heard it and said, oh, send it out. Because we don't remember, Hank and I talked about this with Bruce and Brian, just this last tour I did with the reunion with the Shadows. And we talked about it, and we all agreed that none of us could remember being that good. When we heard that tape, I said, listen to us. The arrangements that I remember, as soon as I heard them, I remembered sitting in the front living room and going, let's do this, or Brian would go, I'm going to play this, or Hank would say, I'm going to do, and the arrangements to the songs were so good, and our chat, we were already into sort of light comedy. I don't remember being that good. It goes to show that really most artists show a potential, and we must have shown that potential. And maybe that's why people like Peter Gormley and Norrie Paramor were not prepared to let go of us, that they said, look, these guys can do it, let's support them. They're not having the hits they had with Move It, but that can change. And it did change, of course. And the only statistics, as far as I know, that you got wrong was the 150 million. The last time, 15 years ago, they did a count-up of all albums and singles and every unit I've ever sold in the world, and it was 250.
Whoops.
So it was only slightly off, only off by 1 million.
Number.
100
Yeah,
million.
100 million. Yes, okay, we'll just sort of gloss over that then.
It's my pleasure to introduce to you, in person, Cliff Richard!
Recorded in London in 1962 with the crowd going crazy, Cliff and the Shadows with Do You Wanna Dance? Coming soon, we'll reflect on how his career developed into everything from becoming a Gerry Anderson puppet to performing in pantomime. And we'll hear which group of the 60s and 70s Sir Cliff said this about.
It was perfection in terms of recording way back then. It was just incredible. I have great respect for them.
I just don't have the heart to tell you. The feeling's gone, it's been missing too long. But I just don't have the heart.
From 1989, that was I Just Don't Have the Heart, written and produced by Stock Aitken and Waterman, whose music dominated the charts of the late 1980s here in the UK. This, of course, is a perfect example of how Cliff continually reinvented himself, as he did when his career seemed to have peaked in the 1960s. When he became a Christian and was having difficulty reconciling that lifestyle with his career in rock and roll music, things were going pretty well. Cliff was starring in the movies, appearing in panto, on television, even as a Gerry Anderson puppet in Thunderbirds Are Go.
We realized very quickly that our audiences were all very, very young. And we could see this massive audience who were their mums and dads, you know, the people who brought them to the hall, dropped them off, and then went home and came back for them later. And so we started to think, well, let's do different things. When we got offered to TV series and stuff, we thought that's the way to get into someone's home, because mum's going to sit and watch in case there's anything untoward and switch it off if we curse or whatever. And so we slowly... And again, Living Doll played a major role in this. And getting into movies where parents would take their children, sit and watch the movie, we slowly won over a group that was in an older age range as well. And that gave you a certain amount of respectability. We were supposedly rebels, but you know, the first band that really, really got through to the mums and dads was the Beatles. I mean, they're the ones that became universally known by all ages. But if you talk about the audiences being young and rebellious, I'm afraid we were way ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, in fairness, John Lennon did describe Move It as the first true British rock and roll record, and he also said that before Cliff and the Shadows, there was nothing worth listening to in this country.
Well, John was, you know, I mean, he was always very straight from the shoulder, and I appreciate what he said, and I've always believed, actually, that Move It was the first real rock and roll record made outside America. I mean, America was already doing fantastic things, and the Beatles were the same age as us, remember? So we were all influenced by them. And I mean, I appreciate what he said, but when he says nothing happened before me, it happened, but it was different. You know, when you listen now to radio and you hear late night shows where twice now I've been driving home from Birmingham, in actual fact, so it's like 11 o'clock at night, and they'll do a whole hour on Matt Monro or a whole hour on Dickie Valentine, and you listen and you hear the interviews and you go, oh my goodness, we're the ones that kicked these guys off the charts. But they were fantastic. We just didn't know how to listen to them, that's all. Now when I listen to Sinatra, and I think that's what John meant really, but he was always controversial, and but I think that's what he meant. That really, in terms of what we loved best, which was all the blues and rhythm and blues and the soul and rock and roll in its entirety, nobody else kind of matched up to that. And I'll always be a rocker at heart, even though my new album is a jazz album. And why? Because I started listening to those bits of music really early. Norrie Paramor had me singing that genre of music way back in 1962.
Talking about John Lennon as we were a moment ago, I did a bit of research because I was thinking I don't ever remember you recording Beatles songs, and then I found I saw her standing there.
Yes.
But oddly enough, I couldn't find anything else.
I did one. And I Love Her.
Oh, yeah.
I did that on an album called Wanted. They probably made it mostly because of the quality of their songs. I mean, they just came out with the best pop rock songs. You know, it was just fantastic. For a while, there was a period when you thought no one else existed, but they did. We were there. One of my favorite bands of all time is the Bee Gees. When you listen to their music, it was aggressive. It was, you know, staying alive and jive talking. It was all kind of, the period was dead right. It was perfection in terms of recording way back then. It was just incredible. I have great respect for them.
Oh, babe. You could have been a bad girl. Wasted all my time. Anything more than you.
Spot the influence of the Bee Gees in I Can't Ask for Any More Than You.
Sir Clifford 70 on Reading 107.
Cliff was again reinventing himself after a second venture into the Eurovision Song Contest in 1973. The album I'm Nearly Famous in 76 was arguably the most significant of his career and gave him massive hits with Miss You Nights and Devil Woman, which was also huge in America. And I also remember was promoted to radio stations with an I'm Nearly Famous badge, which I've still got.
I know, is that good? I'm glad you got it, because the first picture I saw of it, Elton, who released the record on Rocket in America, he had gone out, and there's this picture of him with Liz Taylor, and on her left breast, well, not on the breast, but on the clothes that she's wearing, was an I'm Nearly Famous badge. Now, he's the only one that could pin it there. There's no doubt in my mind. And I got such a thrill. I thought, I can't believe it. Liz Taylor knows about my album.
But it was a brilliant period, that section there. I mean, personally, the album which really I still listen to and have great affection for is Rock and Roll Juvenile, because it was an absolutely outstanding work. That. Do you still look back on that one with pride?
Oh, I do. Yeah, there are some albums that I think back to, and every now and then when I'm on holiday, I dig out one of those albums and play it, and I thought, oh my goodness, I even sang differently then, you know. In a way, I'd forgotten how to do it. I've got some of that voice back, because, you know, you tend to sing whatever's right for the moment, and I went off, you know, I brought my voice level down somewhat, the pitch, the keys down. It was always on the edge of my range, and that's how producers like to push you in, and it was great when you're recording. You don't have to worry about it live. But fortunately for me, I'm able to sing my songs and the keys they were, except two, in fact. When I do We Don't Talk Anymore, I said to them, look, you know, this is not my key. It's just a little too high for me. They said, oh, come on, it's a great track. While I was recording Rock and Roll Juvenile, they came round with it during the session and said, we've got to play you this track. Do you think it'd fit on the album? And in fact, my first feeling was that it didn't actually fit musically on the album. And there was a specific sound to that. We sat there going, oh my God, if ever there's going to be a number one, this is going to be number one. You know, none of us can really say that with certainty, but we had that feeling. And so I thought, yes, please, I'll do it. And okay, you can't change the key? Okay, give me a chance. And I worked out how to do some of the falsetto. I worked out how to sing in that range for that. And nowadays, I take it down a semitone. Because I think to myself, when you're doing it live and you're doing it 55 times during a tour, you just have to keep your voice intact.
Your voice is your instrument.
Yeah. So there are only two tracks I cheat on, and one of them is Wired for Sound, which, again, Alan Tarney said to me when he produced it, it's a good track, though, Cliff. Couldn't you just... Look, we'll keep doing it till you get it. And, of course, I went there and sang, all singing, you know, way up here. And I always take that down a tone on stage. But otherwise, everything else I can do in the same keys, and it's fine.
Used to think that life was sweet.
One of the biggest hits of Cliff Richard's career, We Don't Talk Anymore, from 1979. In the final part of Cliff at 70, here on Reading 107, Cliff talks about his latest reinvention. Cliff swings on his new album, Bold as Brass. And between us, we get, well, a little carried away.
Shibbity-doo, shibbity-doo.
In the middle, you know.
You know, shoo-up, shoo-up, sha-na-na, sha-na-na, sha-na-na.
From May 2005, and another song demonstrating Sir Cliff Richard's ability to reinvent himself at a time when the media thought his chart career was over. That was What Car? Now, before we close this special tribute commemorating Cliff's amazing career, we'll hear what happened when I decided to ask him a question which I figured he may never have been asked before. But first, to the new album Bold as Brass, which was released to coincide with his concerts at the Royal Albert Hall in London. He has performed songs in many different styles over the years, but this time Sir Cliff has ventured into new territory. Bearing in mind how he recalled adapting his vocal style to each new project, the first thing I noticed about this was that he seemed to have had to modify his vocal technique to get the authentic sound.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I walked into the studio in Nashville, and we'd only given ourselves that week 5 days to record the whole album. And I walked in, and when I came in, the band were already running a track. I can't remember whether it was I've Got You Under My Skin or something like that. And I stood there, and the producer looked up, smiled, waved, and he said, I'll say hello to you in a minute. And I thought, how am I don't know whether I can do this. They were so fantastic. And one of the most difficult parts of it was when I wanted to try and ad-lib, because in the jazz genre of music, the chord sequences are really quite different, and they do outrageous things with chords. And I couldn't ad-lib. And in fact, there's 5 tracks that I put ad-libs on, and when I got home, I listened to the tapes over and over again. I got my engineer, got the files sent over from America, and I did them in my bedroom. I did, because I had to learn the ad-libs. You could give me any rock and roll song, and I guarantee I could sing a new melody over the guitar solo. Because you have a feel for the kind of progression of the chords. But I did have to be respectful to the songs. I didn't want to do a rock and roll version of those songs. So Michael O'Martian, the producer, got me 4 top-notch jazz arrangers, and what they've done is they've given me a cushion of authentic, genuine American jazz swing music to sing on. And it meant that I had to just lay back a little bit more and be a little more comfortable and not be too afraid of the rhythm, just to lay back on it. And do you know what? I actually grew to enjoy it. I love it. I'm getting a great kick from singing this stuff. It's wonderful music.
I nearly dropped a saucepan last night when I heard you doing the scat bit in the middle of it. I think it was I've Got You Under My Skin. In the middle, you know.
Yeah, shibbity-doo, shibbity-doo. Yeah, but then you see, what I tried to do was, those are kind of doo-wop sounds. Shoo-wop, shoo-wah. I did sha-na-na, sha-na-na, sha-na-na. Sha-na-na-na-na, shooby, shibbity-doo, shibbity-doo-wee. So they're all rock and roll interjections that the doo-wop crowd used to do, but I've sung it as though it's scat. But scat's quite difficult. If you listen to people like Ella Fitzgerald, it's like another language they're singing. It's incredible.
Great job anyway.
Thank you.
Sha-na-na, sha-na-na. Sha-na-na-na-na, shooby.
Of course, you've had the daunting task of following some pretty good efforts at swing albums from Rod Stewart. Robbie did one.
Yeah.
Paul Anka's Rock Swings album is tremendous as well. But
is it? And of course, I like Michael Bublé is fantastic.
Absolutely, absolutely. But the thing from your point of view, I suppose, really is to create something that not only is fresh, but has the credibility as well.
You mentioned all these names. I mean, I sang some of these songs in 1962, so in terms of chronology, I was way ahead. But none of us can never claim to be the first almost in anything. There's nothing really new. And in fact, I put my album off for about 8 years because of when Robbie came out with his, and I thought, oh no, and I already had 9 tracks ready to record 9 years ago. But I pulled back because he did it. Then Rod came out with his, and I loved. I bought all of Rod's ones, and someone said to me, it doesn't belong to them, I mean, jazz, it's a form of music, like rock and roll doesn't belong to you. And I thought, yeah, they're right, So that's why I went ahead and got special arrangements done so that at least they sound different. And we all sound different to each other anyway, so it's just another choice. But you're right, there's probably an audience out there who know and love those songs, and I've got my fingers crossed that they might like my respectful versions of the songs, although I didn't try to sound like anybody else. I didn't try to sound like a jazz singer. I just sang with my voice.
Your version of I Just Want to Make Love to You, the Etta James song, is tremendous. It's very, very, very good.
When Michael O'Martian said, was there anything from the rock world that you'd like to try and do as a jazz song? I said, well, and I sang him that over the phone. He said, oh, I know that. Yeah, that'll be great. So it's a nod to where I come from. And it's probably the track that's a standout track because it doesn't actually fit the genre completely. It's much more of a blues track, which the arrangers put the brass is fantastic on it, so it latches in. But yeah, I've always liked that. Etta James, that track is one of my favorite tracks of all time.
From the latest Cliff Richard album, Boulders Brass, that's I Just Want to Make Love to You. Well, finally, it's 32 years since I was sent to conduct my first ever radio interview, and when most presenters get to talk to people in the street, I got sent to talk to Cliff Richard. And to quote the title of a rock and roll song, I was shaking all over. Well, a couple of years later, he finally disposed of his birth name of Harry Webb and by deed poll became Cliff Richard. Of course, members of his family still see him regularly, so I had to ask, does anyone still call him Harry?
Nobody that I know calls me Harry. Only people that don't know me and who think that that's the cool thing to do call me Harry. And usually, of course, I don't relate to it.
Because it's not your name anymore.
Harry, I don't respond to it. I came home and I said, look, I've changed my name, and my family all said, well, what is it? I said, it's Cliff Richard. And they all said, okay, Cliff. The only one that made mistakes was my younger sister Joan, who doesn't make any mistakes now, of course, but when she was only 8, 7 and something. And she'd often go, Harry, oops, oh, sorry, Cliff. So she's the only one that took a while to get used to it, but I've spoken to her a lot. In fact, I've spoken to my sisters, and they all say, we can't even think of you as a Harry. They said, you don't even look like a Harry. Not that I know what a Harry looks like.
Apart from in the royal family, yes.
Apart from in the royal family, correct.
So, Cliff Richard, thank you for your time. Greatly appreciate it, and great success with the album and the tour, and thank you so much for joining us on Reading 107.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
and congratulations on your 32 years.
You've been listening to Sir Cliff at 70, presented and produced by Dan Chisholm for Reading 107, with special thanks to Jill Snow at the Cliff Richard Organisation and Sir John Medeski.